Every year, I spend many nights testing different sleeping pads, trying to determine which ones are the most comfortable. And this year, we have the most options ever for comfort-focused pads, including the thickest and widest pads that I've ever tested. I've narrowed things down to the top 6 most comfortable pads in order to help you get a good night's sleep. And today, I'm gonna go over their strengths and their weaknesses so that if you're in search for the sleeping pad love of your life, you can find the right match. Starting with the thickest pad that I've ever tested and the thickest sleeping pad on the market that weighs under a kilogram, we have the Thermarest Neol Loft. I had my parents and my wife Steffi Poo try all 6 of these mattresses, and the Neol Loft was the top choice for Steph and my mom, and the second choice for my dad. But it's not necessarily my top choice, so at the end of this video, I'll share with you what my top 2 favorite comfort-focused sleeping pads are, and it's based off of many nights of testing, and not just a quick test like you do in a store or in my basement. Thermarest is doing a few unique things in order to prioritize comfort with this pad, and I love what they're doing with it. The first thing that they did is they added a sidewall in order to achieve that 4.6-inch thickness. The sidewall allows them to achieve that thickness while still maintaining the supportiveness of the pad once you get to the edges. If you didn't have that sidewall, once you got to the edges, it'd be very either angled or it would collapse very easily. The other thing that they're doing, and it kind of mitigates the fact that they're still using horizontal baffles on this pad, is that they're using a very stretchy top material here. So it's a stretchy polyester, and it means that when you're laying on the pad, you're getting a little bit more pressure relief than you would if it was a really hard kind of nylon or polyester material. The top material is also quite soft, which is really nice to lay on. To top it all off, Thermarest added a little bit more height to the sides of the pad in order to kind of keep you centered on it when you're sleeping. The final strength of the Neol Loft is its warmth. I wasn't expecting this, but it has a very high R value at 4.7. Once you get into really thick pads, it's difficult to maintain a high R value, but because of Thermarest's thermocapture and triangular core matrix technologies, they're able to do that effectively in this pad. I've tested it at around freezing on pretty cold ground, and it was plenty warm. The first downsides of the Neol Loft are its specs. It's very expensive and very heavy at over 800 grams and well over $200. That being said, it's not the heaviest pad on this list, and I was surprised at how low they're able to get the weight for a pad this thick. Some other downsides are more personal preference things and have to do with comfort, starting with the fact that Thermarest is still using horizontal baffles on this pad. It's kind of essential for the technology that they're using for the warmth and the stability of the pad, but I find that horizontal baffles are a little bit more uncomfortable than other kind of baffling systems that we'll see in the other pads, because when I'm laying on my side on my arm will sometimes go numb and fall asleep. But that's alleviated a little bit by the stretchy material that the pad is using, as well as the fact that I can deflate this pad quite a bit due to how thick it is in order to kind of maximize my comfort on it. So when I was sleeping on the pad and testing it out, my arm didn't go numb or fall asleep, but it wasn't quite as good as some other pads for me at relieving pressure points. Some people might also find that when you do deflate the pad in order to get the comfort optimized for yourself, you may find it feeling a little bit balloony, partly because of how thick it is and just how much air is inside this pad. Related to that, the valve system on this pad isn't the easiest for adjusting how much air you have inside the pad. You have one valve on this side in order to inflate it, and then one valve on this side in order to deflate it. So if you're letting air out, you have to kind of slowly undo this valve. And I find that I'm always worried that I'm gonna release it fully and then dump all the air out of the pad. So who's this pad for? Overall, I think it's for heavier people who need a thicker pad in order to not bottom out on their sleeping pad, as well as people who just love a big, thick, cushy mattress like my wife and my mom. Next up, we have the Exped Ultra 5R pad. This is the lightest weight and the warmest pad on this list. I've used the Ultra 5R well below freezing and was toasty warm. I find that the pad actually sleeps a little bit warmer than the R value would indicate. And if you want to save even more weight, especially if you get the mummy version of this pad, you can get the Ultra 3R version, which has a lower R value, but will still keep you warm down to freezing conditions. The material the pad is made of is a little bit stretchy and a little bit soft, not quite as soft and stretchy as on the Neol Loft, but still really comfortable. Exped pads also use vertical baffles, so baffling that runs down the length of the pad, and I find this kind of system a little bit more comfortable than the horizontal baffles that we saw on the Thermarest pad. The pad isn't super thick at 3 inches, but you do have a little bit of extra thickness in these outer baffles, and I find that overall the pad sleeps like it's a little bit of a thicker mattress than that 3 inches would indicate. For weaknesses, I don't think there's a ton for this pad. The vertical baffles might not be for everyone, so that is something that you should test out if you can. As well, the valve system on this pad is not great. There's 2 valves. You have an inflation valve and a deflation valve. They're on the bottom of the pad, which is not my favorite. I like it when valves are on the top of the pad because it makes it a little bit easier to inflate the pad as well as adjust the air that's inside of it. And like I said, it's not the thickest pad out there, but for the majority of people out there, I think it's going to be plenty thick enough. I think this is a great pad for pretty much anybody, but it's going to be especially enticing for people who want to go as ultra light as possible. Like I said, it's the lightest weight pad on this list, and you can get even lighter than the 5R by getting the 3R Mummy version. Next up, we have a pad that if you follow the channel, you're not going to be surprised is on this list. It's the REI Helix. This has been one of my favorite pads for years, but might be getting replaced by some other options that we're going over today. The strengths of the Helix start with the fact that it's a very warm pad as well as a very well-priced pad. But I think the biggest strength, and this is why I really like the pad, is the fact that it does an amazing job with pressure relief due to the baffling system that we have here. With the Helix, you have a series of raised areas and then lowered areas. And when you lay on the pad, the raised areas decrease a little bit, acting kind of like air springs. Because there's so many little pressure relief points, it's much more effective at relieving pressure than pads that use vertical baffles or horizontal baffles. I've tested a lot of pads with this kind of baffling system, and they're not all created equal. The reason why the Helix is more effective than some of the competitors out there is because the distance between the bottom of the low areas and the top of the raised areas is quite significant, so you're getting more compression of those raised areas and relieving more pressure. But it's not all butterflies and rainbows with the Helix. It does have some weaknesses. First of all, the valve system that the pad uses is terrible. You have an inflation valve and a deflation valve on the bottom here, and I dislike that for the same reasons I disliked it on the Exped pad. You also have to inflate the pad so it feels quite firm. That's not going to be intuitive for a lot of people out there. Most of the time, people are decreasing the inflation level of their pads a little bit, but with the Helix, I recommend trying to inflate it as much as you can because that's going to maximize pressure relief and make it so that the pad doesn't feel as thin as it is. It's a 3-inch thick pad, but I find that it sleeps a little bit thinner than that. And for some people, especially people who are on the heavier side, maybe over 220 pounds, you're gonna feel like you're bottoming out with your hip and shoulder more than you would on other pads. The REI Helix is one of those pads where you really have to spend an entire night sleeping on it in order to appreciate how comfortable it is and how much that pressure relief makes a difference. This pad is really geared towards side sleepers under 220 pounds who find when they're using other pads, maybe their hip feels uncomfortable or their arm is going numb and falling asleep. It's basically the best pad out there for pressure relief. The Zenbivy Flex Air is a very similar pad to the REI Helix. It uses a similar baffling pattern, but compared to the Helix, there's some key differences. First of all, the valve on the Zenbivy is a lot better. You have this two-way inflation-deflation valve that's on the top of the pad, so it's really easy to adjust how much air you have in the pad even while you're laying on it, which is great. It also has a stretchier, softer top material to it, which is gonna be really nice for some people out there, especially if you like sleep naked under a quilt. It's gonna feel a lot nicer to lay on the Zenbivy. But personally, I find that the Zenbivy isn't quite as good at the Helix at pressure relief, and that's because the difference in height between the lower areas and then the raised areas isn't quite as significant as on the REI Helix. It also has the same downside as the Helix in that it feels quite thin when you're laying on it and you might bottom out if you're on the heavier side. So who's this pad for? It's for people who may not like the REI Helix, but they still want really good pressure relief. This is the pad that you're gonna wanna go for, especially if you want something with this stretchy, softer top and a better valve. If you want, you can head over to packwizard.com and compare the Zenbivy to the REI Helix directly, or compare any other pads on the market using the Sleeping Pad database and comparison tool. Next up, we have a pad that people have been asking me to take a look at from a comfort perspective for years. It's the Nemo Quasar 3D. The big strength of this pad is how supportive it is. It uses a curved horizontal baffle system, which I find more comfortable than non-curved horizontal baffles. It has this raised head area and some raised sides as well. This isn't the most comfortable pad for me on the market, but if you're a back sleeper, I think you're gonna absolutely love the Quasar because of how supportive it is and how it feels when you're laying on your back. The downsides with this pad are, first of all, its weight. It's the second heaviest pad that we're looking at today. It's also the least warm. It'll keep you warm down to about freezing conditions, but nothing below that. Also, because it uses horizontal baffles, even though they are the curved version, it's still not quite as good for side sleepers and for pressure relief as some of the other baffling systems we've looked at. I think this pad is very well set up for back sleeper. So if you are primarily a back sleeper, then definitely check out the Quasar 3D. The sixth pad is the Big Agnes Boundary Deluxe, but in the 30-inch wide version. This is the only 30-inch wide pad on the market that's still light-ish, warm, and comfortable. This was my dad's favorite pad, and then the second choice for both my mom and Steffi Poo. The obvious strength with the Boundary Deluxe is its width. That width really comes in handy if you're a back sleeper and you're very broad, or if you're a side sleeper that sleeps in the fetus position. When you have your butt sticking out and your knees kind of curled up, having that extra width means that you're not hanging off the pad on any one side. The pad is also really good at pressure relief. You have this kind of hybrid dimpled and then vertical baffling system, so it's not quite as comfortable as the REI Helix or the Zenbivy Flex Air, but it's more comfortable than a pad like the Exped Ultra 5R. You also have a valve system on top of the pad, so it's really easy to access in order to adjust how much air you have inside the pad. And then it's just a generally warm pad as well. I've had issues with other big Agnes pads that use reflective insulation, not sleeping as warm as the R value would lead you to believe. But with the Boundary Deluxe, it uses a synthetic fill insulation, and I found that it sleeps as warm as you'd expect for the R value. The first downside is its weight. It's the heaviest pad we're looking at today at over 1 kilogram, so super heavy. It might also be too big to fit in a lot of one-person tents, or it might be too big to fit in a 2-person tent if you're both using this pad or you're using this and someone else is using a 25-inch wide pad. The top material also isn't quite as soft as some of the other pads, but for me that's not a very big deal because I'm usually wearing some sort of base layer and not sleeping directly on the pad. So who's this pad for? Anyone who's very broad and sleeps on their back, or if you sleep in the fetus position and really are going to take advantage of that width, then this pad is going to be for you. It wasn't the most comfortable for me. I find that the pressure relief wasn't quite where I need it to be as a side sleeper, but for a lot of people out there, I think they're really going to enjoy this pad if they're willing to eat that weight penalty. Before we get into what my top 2 picks are, I want to address some notable exceptions that weren't on this list because I know if I don't address this, I'm going to get a ton of comments about them. The first exception is the Big Agnes Repeat. Like I mentioned when I was talking about the Boundary Deluxe, Big Agnes is using reflective insulation in some of their sleeping pads, and I find that in those pads, they're not sleeping as warm as the R value would indicate. So even though the Repeat has an R value in the 4s, I found that I was cold even well above freezing conditions. The second notable exception is the Etherlite XT by Sea to Summit. It is a very comfortable pad, but for this list, I made a decision to only include pads that are quite warm, that are going to keep you warm down to about freezing conditions or even below, and the Etherlite XT is just a very cold pad. The third notable exception are pads made by the company Kilos Gear. I tested the Aero Cloud, which is basically just a more ultralight, less warm version of their other pad, and I found it just wasn't comfortable. So because of that, it didn't make the list. That's just my personal preference. You might find it comfortable, but for me, it just didn't stack up to these other 6 pads. When it comes to which pads were my favorite for comfort, it was actually a really tough decision. I bounced around between pretty much all of them except for the Quasar 3D because I'm a side sleeper, but I landed on the REI Helix just because I know how good of sleeps I get on this pad. I will sleep through the entire night without waking up, just slightly shifting positions over the course of the night, and that's very rare for any sort of sleeping pad. My other favorite pad is the Thermarest Neol Loft. Thermarest has always been the leader when it comes to warmth and weight for sleeping pads, but it was really cool seeing them make an entry into the comfort realm, and I think they did a home run with the Neol Loft. This is going to be the go-to pad for a lot of people out there who are prioritizing comfort, especially because they're able to make a pad this comfortable while still keeping the weight relatively low. One of the prime complaints I hear people having with the Helix is that they bottom out when they're laying on their side, either their shoulder or their hip hit the ground, or their bum hits the ground when they're laying on the back. The Neol Loft is going to solve that problem for a lot of people out there while being almost just as comfortable when you deflate it a little bit due to that stretchy material that's on top and how much thickness it has. Go check out this video if you want to see my 2024 sleeping pad awards. I give out awards for the best ultralight pad, the best all-arounder pad, the best warm pad, as well as a bunch of other categories.